Okay. All right. So last session we talked about a little bit about the money and characteristics of money, and we talked a little bit about the Fed uh, and what's the roles, what roles the Fed has, and uh, we know that one of the roles is to supervise the banking system. And here we're going to talk today, we're going to talk about the banking system and in particular the money multiplier, how money gets multiplied when it gets introduced into the banking system. Now, for this, we have to start out with just a little bit of basics of how banks work and very, very basic of how banks work. Well, those are financial institutions, and first questions that I would have for you is where do they get their money, the banks?
From their customers?
Yeah, from their customers, right? So they get the money from us and they take this money and they could put it in their vault and do nothing with it. But that would be kind of dumb because they would make
No interest.
yeah, no money, exactly, no interest. They would earn nothing, and they would just do us a favor. Well, actually, they could charge us. They could charge us for storing this, but they discovered that there's an even better way of making money than charging us for storing that money, but taking that money and putting it to work and loaning out money and making loans. Okay, so they take the money from us and then they give it to the people who need money for whatever they want to purchase. Okay, and obviously those people are going to pay a price, the people who are borrowing the money, and that's called interest, and that's how banks make money. Now, obviously you would think that, well, okay, so if banks make money on the money that they loan out, they earn interest on that money, then that means that the more money they loan out, the more interest they're going to be able to earn, and therefore their more profits are going to make. Well, but can they loan out everything that is being deposited with them? And the answer is obviously no, you cannot loan out 100%, because if you loan out 100%, somebody could go to the bank and want to withdraw some of their money, and the bank would have to say, well, sorry, today we don't have any money for you, come back tomorrow, maybe you'll get lucky. It cannot work like that. So that's why we have something called, and by the way, it doesn't matter whether you have a central bank system or you have an independent banking system. There are countries that don't have a central bank. Still, banks will have this type of a system where it's fractional. They take deposits and a fraction of those deposits will be loaned out. So it's called the fractional banking system. And the fractional banking system works whether there's a central bank or there's no central bank, So banks taking money and they loan a fraction of that money out to other people who are willing to pay interest for their money. Okay, fine. Now, for the sake of our system here in the US, we're going to talk about how much money the banks can loan out. Obviously, they can loan out only a certain amount. And in this country, because we do have a central bank, it's the central bank that actually determines how much the banks can loan out. What is the maximum amount of money that can be loaned out of the total deposits? Okay, so, but I want you to realize that if left on their own, the banks would not go crazy and loan out everything. Okay, so they're not, out there, they're responsible and reasonable, and they realize that they have to hold a certain amount of money in reserves for people who want some of their money back. So it so happens that this reserve requirement is set in this country by the Federal Reserve. But if there was no Federal Reserve, the banks would set a reserve requirement on their own. Okay, so here are a couple of definitions. Basically, the first one is the reserve requirement ratio. And that is the percentage of total deposits that a bank has to hold in cash in the vault or deposited with the Federal Reserve. So suppose that a bank has a lot of money in deposits and in checkable deposits, and they have to hold a certain amount in cash in required reserves, but they don't have a vault big enough to hold that amount of cash. Well, they can always go to the Federal Reserve and the Fed will hold that money for them in their vaults. Okay. So it's not a problem if you don't have a vault big enough, the Fed will take it. And they will not charge the banks anything for that money. Okay. But that's okay because they may not charge the banks for that money, but the Fed is going to make some money off of it because they will loan out sometimes that money and they will charge interest. So the Fed takes on their own money for free and then loans it for a fee, and they're going to earn, and that's the money that they earn. Okay, so this is the reserve requirement ratio. Okay, you have a certain amount in deposits and you can loan out a maximum, and a certain percentage you have to hold it in the vault in the form of cash. And it can be either in the bank's vault or deposited with the Fed. It doesn't matter. I just want to tell you that different types of banks, depending on how big they are, what type of banks they are, they will have different reserve requirement ratio. For the purposes of this class, I'm just going to refer to the reserve requirement ratio for large commercial banks such as B of A or Chase or Wells Fargo. Most of the banking system, which is those large type, they will have a reserve requirement ratio on checkable deposits of 10%. And then that can vary. The Fed can change it, but right now is 10%. Okay. In other words, if they have checkable deposits, checking accounts worth $100 million, they have to hold $10 million in cash, in the form of cash. So, and that can change. The Fed can raise the reserve requirement, force the banks to hold more money in the form of cash in the vault, or to hold less money in the form of money in the vault, in the form of cash, I'm sorry, in the vault. So the Fed can change that. Okay. Now, given that I said to you that the reserve requirement ratio on checkable accounts is 10%, and we know that there are not only checkable accounts within the banking system, but there are also saving accounts. My question for you would be the following. If checkable accounts, the Fed set a reserve requirement of 10%, they have to hold 10% in cash. What do you think would be a reasonable reserve requirement for saving accounts? In other words, I'm not asking you for the exact value because we don't know it, but would you expect a higher or a lower reserve requirement ratio for saving accounts?
A lower?
A lower, because saving accounts have a lot less traffic within that system, right? You with checking accounts, you have a lot of traffic. You take money in and out. With saving accounts, you deposit it and you forget it. Okay. And as a matter of fact, the reserve requirement ratio on saving accounts is actually 0, which would imply that with saving accounts, you deposit the money in saving accounts and the bank can take 100% of that money and loan it out. One thing that really this tells us is that probably the reserve requirement ratio on checking accounts is probably set quite a bit higher than any risk factor. Okay, in other words, you set the checking accounts a little bit higher, and therefore you can afford saving accounts to be actually zero, because if there's any withdrawal from the saving accounts, you have plenty of money available from the reserves from the checking accounts. Okay, so if you have a little bit higher in one, you can have it a lower in the other one. Obviously, if that was not the case, it would be kind of dangerous to have saving accounts, I'm sorry, with zero. In other words, the bank can loan out 100% of the saving money. And what happens if somebody goes in and says, well, I want some of my money back? Well, the bank would, so obviously there's a reserve from the other side. All right. Now I just want to mention another reserve, which is called total reserves. And we're going to compare total reserves with required reserves. So it's the percentage of deposits that a bank has, that a bank chooses to hold in cash, in the vault, or with Fed. So notice the slight difference between reserve requirement ratio and total reserve ratio. Here with total reserves is you have $1 million in deposit, and the bank may choose to hold 30% or 40% in cash. Why would they choose that? They may be wary of the economy. They may be afraid that the economy may be going into a recession. And if you feel that the economy is going to go into a recession, what are you going to do? Make more loans or fewer loans? If you are afraid that the economy is going to stumble.
Fewer.
Fewer, right. Because when the economy stumbles, when the economy goes into a recession, that's the time when firms are going bankrupt. Okay. In other words, they're not going to be able to pay their loans back. People are losing their jobs. They're not going to be able to pay their loans back. So when the economy is stumbling, that's the time when banks tend to be more safety conscious, more risk averse, if you will. And then they're going to be a little more cautious, and they're going to keep more cash on hands rather than make out loans. Because remember, when money comes in, all the bank can do is keep it in or loan it out. Okay. Well, usually banks loan out when times are good, when firms are prosperous, when people are prosperous, and they're going to be able to pay those loans back. But if times turn bad, then they tend to be a little bit. So the Fed says, well, you can loan out 90%. But the bank says, okay, but I'm going to keep, instead of loaning out 90%, I'm going to loan out 50%. And I'm going to stay rich in cash here, and not too many loans outstanding. Okay. So, folks, if we were to look at total reserves versus required reserves, a question for you: can we have a situation like this? Is it okay to have total reserves greater than required reserves? Is that a situation that is okay or not?
Yes.
Yes. So this is okay. No problem. How about total reserves less than required reserves?
No.
No, okay. I'm sorry. I didn't want to write it like that. I wanted to put, how about total reserves equal to required reserves? Yeah, exactly. So this is the only situation that is not okay, when the bank is holding 5%, but they're required to hold 10% in cash. Well, what they're gonna do? Uh, if that's the case, if a bank finds itself in a situation where they have total reserves less than required reserves, they're going to have to come up with a difference. Well, they're going to have to borrow that difference. And they can borrow money from the Fed, or they can borrow money from each other. Most of the time, banks will choose to borrow money from each other. And those are short-term loans. They are overnight loans. So at the end of the day, when you do the books, you turn out that, we're not meeting the reserve requirement. Okay, well, we're going to come up with some money, and they will take loans from each other. And you think they're going to pay interest to each other? Yes or no? If a bank needs money, and they need money and they need to go to borrow either from the Fed or from other banks, will they pay interest or not? Do you ever get money for free? No, no, you don't get money for free. So you're going to pay interest. Okay, it's going to be overnight interest for a loan for overnight. But you're gonna pay interest. Nobody gets money for free. So, and obviously, if they borrow money from each other, you realize that if a bank is not meeting the required reserve and has to borrow money from another bank, that means that the other banks has some excess reserves. In other words, another bank has to be in this situation where they are holding more cash than the required reserve, and therefore they are able to make out that loan and not get themselves into trouble, right? So here, when total reserve is greater than required reserve, total reserves minus required reserves is called excess reserves. And question for you, what can a bank do with those excess reserves? Whenever a bank has excess reserves, they can take that money and
Lend it.
lend it out, exactly, and make some money. Okay. Whether they choose to do that or not, again, it depends. If the bank chooses not to do it because they're afraid that it's risky, then they're not going to do it. Okay. And we're going to see a little bit later on, not next week as we have Thanksgiving week, but the week after that, we're going to talk about the fact that monetary policy doesn't work very well because we have a problem. Um, and one of the problems is here. When the economy stumbles, when the economy is going into a recession, that's when you need to put money into the economy to create that demand for goods and services, right? But is that a time when banks want to make loans? No, no. So, what the Fed can do is the Fed can make money available and pump it into the banking system. Okay, they can do that. But if the banks don't make those loans, and not only that, not only the banks don't like to make the loans when the economy is stumbling, but when the economy is going into a recession, is that a time when people want to take out loans and buy goods? No, I'm not buying cars. I'm not buying a car when I'm in danger of losing my job. I'm not buying, renovating my kitchen when I'm in danger of losing the job. So you have a twofold. The lenders don't want to lend, and the borrowers don't want to borrow. And that's exactly the time when you want the exactly opposite to happen. You want the lenders to lend and the borrowers to borrow. But that's human nature, that when times are tough, the risk is high, and the lenders don't want to lend and the borrowers don't want to borrow. We're going to get into that a little bit more. All right, so let's talk about that money multiplier. Now that we have reserve requirement. Folks, let's suppose, and I'm going to show you the money multiplier, how it works. And I'm going to give you an example. By the way, so you know, my example is a ridiculous example. It's fictitious, not only fictitious, but it's unrealistic. And it's unrealistic for a reason, because in real life, it doesn't happen. So I tell you, on one hand, you have this money multiplier, but then on the other hand, I tell you, well, it doesn't happen. Well, it doesn't happen the way I am presenting it, but it happens in other ways. Okay, so we're gonna go my way first, and then I'm gonna explain how come I had to use this type of an example, unrealistic type of an example. Okay, let's suppose that the reserve requirement in the banking system is 10%. So the banks can loan out 90% of their deposits. Folks, the way I'm going to do it is I'm going to introduce money into the banking system this way. I'm digging in my backyard. I'm trying to enlarge my pond. So I'm digging and I'm digging, and I try to make it nice and bigger and so on. So as I'm digging, suddenly I'm hitting something that sounds like metal. So it's a aluminum suitcase that I find in my backyard, buried in my backyard. And guess what? In that aluminum suitcase, I find $100,000 in cash. Now I find $100,000 in cash. I'm like, whoa, you know, I have $100,000 on my hands. What am I going to do with it? I don't want to keep it in my house. I'm afraid, you know, I'm going to get robbed or something. So what do? I go to a bank and deposit that money in the bank. Let's leave out any tax implications and stuff like that. That's irrelevant for now. Okay. As far as I'm concerned, there are no taxes. Okay, and any legalities, I don't know. You know. So I deposit $100,000 in my bank. Okay, when I deposit 100, let's say my bank is B of A. Here's B of A. And in their ledger, B of A has, on one hand, it has assets, and on the other hand, L stands for anybody. If this is assets, this is
liabilities.
Liabilities, right? Very good. Nowadays, I don't see that very often, assets and liabilities, but that's the way I did it when I was in school. Okay, so B of A has assets and liabilities, and I go over there to B of A with $100,000 in cash, and I deposit that $100,000. I open up a new account, my account, in my name. Okay, and I give them $100,000. Okay, folks, I'm asking you, when I give B of A $100,000, how much does B of A's assets increase, decrease? What changes over there? Remember, I gave them $100,000.
It would increase by 100,000.
Absolutely. They have an additional $100,000. Absolutely, like you said, in cash. So they have an additional $100,000. Very good. Okay. Now, I'm asking you, what's going to happen to the liability side for B of A? I gave them $100,000. They are responsible for how much of that $100,000? But before you answer, think of it this way. I give you to keep my dog. How much of my dog are you liable to me for?
100% of the dog.
100% of the dog. Exactly. A lot of times people take this into account and they will say, oh, $90,000. Wow, that would be an extremely profitable bank where you deposit $100,000 and they owe you $90,000. So they are liable to you for $100,000. Absolutely. And here I'm going to put CD. CD stands for checkable deposits. In other words, I can now write checks up to $100,000. So now they gave me a checking book. I have a checking account, and I can tear out a check and buy something for $100,000. I write down the check $100,000. Folks, question for you. If I write a check for $100,000, is that check money? Absolutely. That check is money. Remember last class, I said to you, well, what if I give you a check for $10 million? I write you a check for $10 million. I give it to you. Is that money? And you correctly said, absolutely not. Unfortunately, that is true. That's the case. I wish it wasn't. So if the check bounces, that's not money. But if the check clears, in this case, the check is going to clear because I do have $100,000 deposited with them. That check is money. So this $100,000 in check is money. That's what I want you to understand, that check is money. Okay, very good. So I can write, I can buy $100,000 worth of goods and services. That's my point. Okay, good. Well, what is B of A going to do now? B of A, they want to make some money. So they're going to keep 10% of this deposit in cash. In the vault. And then they want to make loans in order to earn interest, to make money. Okay, so they're going to make loans. Well, who are they going to make the loan to? One of you wants to buy a car. Okay, so you want to buy a car, and that car is going to cost you $90,000. Well, what kind of car are you going to buy? That a car that it's $90,000. Let's see. Let's think about it. Might be a how much is a Tesla? About 100,000 or? Yeah, let's say that you buy a Tesla. Okay. So you buy a Tesla. Tesla is $90,000. So you take out this loan of $90,000. You go to a Tesla dealer. You give the Tesla dealer the $90,000. They give you the car. You drive off the lot. You're done. At the end of the day, what do you think that the Tesla dealer is going to do with that money? They're going to take it and they're going to deposit that money in their own bank account, right? So let's say that they have a bank account with Chase. Well, they deposit $90,000 into Chase. So the assets of Chase are going up by $90,000 because they got $90,000 deposited. And obviously the liabilities of Chase also go up because now they're responsible for that deposit. They're responsible to the Tesla dealer. They gave Chase $90,000. Now the Tesla dealer can write checks up to $90,000. So their liability go up by $90,000. But now Chase, they want to make money. So they're going to hold, how much will they hold in the vault?
9,000.
9,000, 10% of those deposits. 10% of the deposits is $9,000. So this $90,000 is going to become $9,000 cash in the vault, plus another $81,000 loans. So they can earn interest and make some money. Now, who's going to get that money? Somebody who wants to take out a loan. So one of you now wants to buy a car. You want to buy a Tesla, but you're happy not with a brand new Tesla, but with a slightly used Tesla, which is $81,000. So you take out the $81,000 loan. You go to a slightly used Tesla dealer. You buy that slightly used Tesla. You drive off the lot. They get the money. They take the money. At the end of the day, they're going to deposit the money in their bank accounts, which is Wells Fargo. They get 81,000. They are going to be responsible for 81,000 because the slightly used Tesla dealer can now write checks worth $81,000. And then the process keeps on going and going and going and going. So I'm not going to go any more steps than that. Here's the deal, folks, what I want you to see here. Initially, how much money was there introduced in the economy? How much? $100,000, exactly, $100,000. That's the money that I dug out of my backyard. So that's initially the increase in the money supply, $100,000. Happens after a while. I know that in my example, everything happens instantaneously. Well, it's not going to be instantaneously, but for the purposes of my example, let's say it takes place immediately. How much can I, how much worth of goods can I buy? Can I write checks for?
You can write checks for $100,000.
Exactly. So the money supply has increased by $100,000 because I can buy $100,000 worth of goods and services. How about the Tesla dealer? How much can they buy goods and services worth?
$90,000.
$90,000. They have checks that are going to clear $90,000, so they can buy $90,000. So the money supply has increased by $100,000. I can write checks for $100,000. Plus $90,000, the Tesla dealer can write checks for $90,000. Plus $81,000, the slightly used Tesla dealer can write checks for $81,000. And then it's going to go on and on and on. So the money supply increases by 100 plus 90 plus 81 plus 72 plus 63 plus 54 and so on. So the money supply, if you add up all those increases in the money supply, remember all those checks are money. Okay, all the checks are money. The money supply has increased not by 100,000, but 100 plus 90 plus 81. That adds up to $1 million. So the money supply has multiplied from $100,000 to $1 million. So folks, what is the money multiplier in this example that I gave you? If I put in $100,000 into the economy and the money supply increases not by $100,000, but by $1 million, that means that the money multiplier was equal to
10.
10, exactly. It equals to 10. It multiplied by 10. Okay. Well, what do you think that money multiplier came from? Where? What does it depend upon? What is the variable that it depends on? Whether it's going to be 10, or it's going to be 5, or it's going to be 8, or it's going to be 2, or it's going to be whatever.
The reserve ratio?
The reserve ratio, exactly. The reserve ratio. Let me give you a quick example. I'm not going to write over this, but you get the idea immediately, I think. Check this out. Let's change the reserve requirement from 10% to 50%. If the Fed changed the reserve requirement from 10% to 50%, that means that the banks cannot loan 90%, but they can only loan 50%. They have to hold 50% of the money in cash in the vault. So same example, I dig up $100,000. I go to B of A. I deposit $100,000. I can write checks for $100,000. But now B of A has to hold 50 in cash, and they can only loan out 50. So the person who takes out that loan, they're gonna take out a loan for 50. They're gonna deposit that $50,000 in their bank account. They can write checks for 50. the bank will have to hold 25 and they can loan out 25. Somebody else takes out that loan for 25. They deposit in their checking account. Now, the bank gets 25. The person can write checks for 25 and so on. So now the money multiplier goes by 100 plus 50 plus 25 plus 12.5 plus 6.750 and so on. So the money multiplier is going to be a lot smaller. And it turns out that the money multiplier would be equal to 2. In other words, the initial increase was $100,000. The final increase would be $200,000. Okay. So what determined that? It was the reserve requirement ratio. So let's come up with a formula for the money multiplier. One divided by RR. That's why when the reserve requirement ratio was 10%, so at 10%, money multiplier is equal to 1 divided by 0.1, because that's how we write 10%, 0.1. So it's equal to 10. If the reserve requirement is 50%, money multiplier equals 1 divided by 0.5 equals 2. So folks, notice that if the Fed would want to increase the money supply in the economy, what do you think that they would do to the reserve requirement ratio? If they would want to make more money available in the economy to buy goods and services,
they would lower it.
They would lower it, right? They would require the banks to hold less and less money in the vault and to make more and more loans that hopefully will buy goods and services. That's the whole idea here, is you want to get money out into the economy to buy goods and services, to create more demand for goods and services, to stimulate that aggregate demand. That's the whole idea. To stimulate the economy, you want to stimulate aggregate demand. You want to get people to buy. You want to get businesses to buy. You want to, so they want to make this money available. Again, the problem is, people don't want to borrow. Businesses don't want to borrow when times are tough, Okay. Now, why did I use an example where I found money in the backyard? Because we don't find money in the backyard. We don't find money buried, stuff like that. So it's not a realistic example. So this money multiplier, while it takes place, it doesn't take place when I deposit money into a bank account. Money multiplier, by the way, so it also works in a negative way when you withdraw money. In other words, if you take money out of the banking system, it's the money supply in the banking system doesn't decrease, doesn't shrink by the amount that you take out, but it shrinks by more because of this multiplying effect. Okay, so you take out $100,000 and the money supply shrinks by $1 million. Okay, so you have a positive when you deposit money, and you have a negative when you take out money. But guess what? We never create those positive multipliers or negative multipliers. Why don't we do that? Well, here it is why. So we said that when money is introduced in the banking system, we're going to have this positive multiplier. If the money is taken out of the banking system, we're going to have a negative multiplier. Okay, so money goes in, positive multiplier. Money goes. Okay, folks, for the money to see this money multiplier, for us to have the money multiplier, money has to come from outside of the banking system into the banking system. And in my example, the money was sitting in my backyard and it was out of the banking system. But folks, in everyday life, I cannot think of any situation where the money comes out of the banking system and goes into the banking system, unless for a few minor things, you know. But it doesn't really happen. When you deposit some money into your account, when you deposit a check into your account, and you deposit cash into your account, you deposit any money into your account, where is that money coming from? It comes from somebody else's account. Exactly. It comes out of their account into your account. So it comes from within the banking system right back into the banking system. When you take money out of your bank, because you want to go shopping, at the end of the day, what do you think that money is going to end up? In Macy's bank account, or in Vans's bank account, or whoever bank's account. So money always flows from within the banking system. No multiplier there. For the multiplier to take place, we got to find it someplace outside of the banking system. We don't find money outside of the banking system. We don't find it in the backyard. Now, for this negative multiplier to take place, you take money and then you deposit, and then you don't get the money. They don't deposit it in the banking system. What they're going to do with it? Well, they're going to put it in their mattress. Does that happen? Not really. Okay. So we don't have a situation where money comes out of the banking system, as far as we are concerned as everyday people, or we take money out of the banking system. Okay. So we don't create those multipliers. So who can create these multipliers in the money supply? And that is the Fed, because the Fed has huge reserves of cash that is sitting in their vault doing absolutely nothing. That money is not part of the money supply. It's not part of our economy. It's just sitting there. And then suddenly they introduce it, and they introduce that $100,000. Then we're going to have that multiplier. Or the Fed, if they want to reduce the money supply, they take money out of the banking system. But guess what? That money does not go right back into the banking system. It goes into a vault and it's sitting there. That's going to cause a negative money shrinkage. Okay? So only the Okay, so I see how we're gonna handle this on the tape. It was my internet. I'm thinking. So only the Fed can do those money multipliers, either in a positive way or in a negative way. So when we deposit a check or we deposit cash, any money into our account, that money comes from another account. So it goes out of the one into another. And when we take the money out, then it goes into another account. So it goes out of ours into another. So it goes all the time within the banking system. Okay, now somebody may say, and this is what I'm going to end with, but this money multiplier doesn't make sense because, well, what if everybody wants to take their money out? Everybody wants to buy at the same thing. And the answer is no problem, because the assumption here is that the money will always end up right back into the banking system. And all I got to do is, again, show you one by one what happens and that there is no problem. All steps is exactly the same. So let's say that I buy $100,000. Remember, I deposit $100,000. Oh, Jesus, it's unstable again. I deposit $100,000. They loaned out $90,000. So the bank doesn't have that $100,000, right? But I can write checks for $100,000, right? Okay. Now I buy something worth $100,000. Okay. Now I buy it. That check is going to get deposited into some other bank, right? Okay. But how much money, actual cash, is going to be transferred? Well, is going to be the cash from one bank to another bank. So $10,000, right? Well, that means that now the other bank is going to hold $10,000 in cash and $90,000 in loan. So altogether, they are meeting the reserve requirement on that loan. So they're fine. They're fine. They have the $10,000 cash out of the $100,000. And the next step, the other person who took a loan for $90,000 and they spend $90,000. Well, okay, they spend $90,000. The Tesla dealer got it, and the Tesla dealer, let's say, buys something worth $90,000. Okay, now the bank was holding only $9,000 in cash on that $90,000 loan. But that's okay, because now that money gets transferred to another bank, and the bank still has $9,000 in cash out of $90,000 loan. So they're still perfectly fine. So the system transfer from one bank to another bank continuously in the banking system. As long as all that money is transferred within the banking system, then everything is okay. Now, of course, you would have a problem if I would want to have $100,000 in cash, and somebody wants to have $90,000 in cash, and somebody wants to have $81,000 in cash. Obviously, you cannot have that situation because there isn't that much cash there. You know, we only deposited 100,000. But as long as, and this doesn't happen, where why would anybody want to? I'm going to hold it in cash. I'm going to hold it in my house. You know. No, when you take out a loan, you buy something. When you buy something, whoever gets it is going to deposit their money and so on. So the money always gets back into the banking system. Therefore, the banking system will always have enough cash in reserve requirements for the amount of money that is available in loans out into the economy. Okay, so the $100,000 is going to meet the reserve requirement for the $1 million that has been created. So now we have this this example of the money multiplier. So you may see questions on a test if, for example, if there's $1 million introduced in the economy and the reserve requirement is 25%. By how much can possibly the money supply increase in that economy? And then you will say, okay, well, if the reserve requirement is 25%, money multiplier is equal to 4. So if there was an initial increase in the money supply of $1 million, then the final total increase, obviously the maximum increase in the money supply would have to be equal to $4 million. and obviously you can also see that if banks do not, if they do not loan out the maximum percentage that they can loan out. In other words, if they are holding more than the reserve requirement ratio, if the banks are holding more in cash in the vault than the reserve requirement ratio, what do you think is going to happen to the money multiplier? So instead of holding 10%, they're holding 30%, which means that instead of loaning out 90%, they're loaning out only 70%. What's going to happen to the money multiplier?
It's going to go down.
It's going to go down. Exactly. It's going to go down. Right. This is the end of chapter 15. So next week we have Thanksgiving week. And when we come back, we're going to talk about monetary policy. And monetary policy deals with what the Fed can do to increase the money supply, if you will, in the economy, to increase the activity of money in the economy. Okay. And they have a direct way where they actually are impacting the money supply, or they have an indirect way where they're impacting the cost of money, which is, we all know, the cost of money is called, starts with an I.
Interest.
Interest, right. The cost of money is interest. So they can make the cost of money more expensive or less expensive. So there are certain ways that the Fed can impact the amount of activity of money in the economy by either increasing the money supply, decreasing the money supply, or making the cost of borrowing money more expensive or less expensive. You know, the whole idea is that you increase the amount of activity of money. In other words, buying goods and services, more goods and services, or fewer goods and services. Because ultimately, this is what impacts the economy, is not how much money you have in the economy or how expensive or inexpensive is the cost of borrowing money, and this is where we're going to talk about the lack of power on the part of the Fed, is not what they do with the money, but it's what's actually is going to be done with the money, because the ultimate activity is the spending of that money. Okay, if the money is available but nobody's spending, it's a big who cares. If the money is cheap but nobody's borrowing, it's a big who cares. Okay, so the Fed can only do so much. They can bring water, but if you don't drink the water, well, then who cares? You're still gonna die of thirst. So we're gonna take a look at the tools that the Fed has available. We're gonna talk about monetary policy in 2 weeks. We already know a tool that the Fed has available at its disposal for increasing or decreasing the money supply, and that is to change the reserve requirement ratio. And you tell me, if the Fed wants to stimulate the economy to increase the amount of money that is being loaned out and hopefully is going to be able to be loaned out and people will spend that money, what might they do to the reserve requirement ratio?
Lower it.
Exactly. They're going to lower it, right? And if they want to cool off the economy, they're going to raise it, right? But you see, if the Fed lowers the reserve requirement, the economy is going into a recession and the Fed lowers the reserve requirement ratio, that doesn't mean necessarily that loans will be made out. That doesn't mean that people will take out loans. Okay. And yep. Okay, folks. So at this point, let me stop the recording.